Hi, my name is Sarah Estenson, and I'm here to talk about temporal lobe epilepsy. So the temporal lobe is located right underneath the parietal lobe, right above the brain stem. So it's about like right here. It's really important for processing auditory information. So this is, for example, where Wernicke's area is located, which is really important for speech comprehension and understanding. So this is why a lot of times when people have this type of epilepsy, they'll kind of say things out of order or say things that don't really make sense. This is also where a lot of other types of sensory input are integrated. So, for example, types of vision, language, emotion, and memory. So it kind of makes sense that some people who experience this type of epilepsy after their first seizure or maybe continuously, they'll experience changes in their personality or different types of behavior because it's just sort of like their whole integration of who they are is right here. For example, Ramachandran talked about a man who had right temporal lobe epilepsy who became suddenly fascinated with poetry for the first time in his life, and he never had before. The limbic system is also located here, so the hippocampus and the amygdala. These are obviously important for memory and also smell. People will sometimes experience auras, which is sort of like a warning sign that they might be having a seizure, and this can sometimes come in the sense of like a weird random smell out of nowhere. So also since the hippocampus is here, this is why some people experience loss of memory. For more of a reference on what the area is really important for, we can talk about other kind of conditions and disorders that are affected in this area. For example, prosopagnosia, which is the inability to correctly process faces, not be able to recognize people. People who experience schizophrenia will often have a smaller volume in the entirety of the lobe. Korsakoff's, which usually occurs with people who have experienced alcoholism for a long amount of time in their life, and so they have a consistent vitamin B deficiency. And Alzheimer's, interestingly, specifically one of the first signs of Alzheimer's is when clients will experience like a loss of their sense of smell. Also, obviously, Alzheimer's goes back to the whole loss of memory and the hippocampus. So now to talk more about seizures in general and epilepsy. About 50 million people around the world are affected by epilepsy, and about 35 million are specifically affected by temporal lobe epilepsy. So this is the most common type of focal epilepsy, meaning that it's localized in one portion of the brain rather than a generalized type of seizure, which occurs all over the brain. They usually only last about a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes, not usually longer than that. To get more into the symptoms of a focal seizure, oftentimes people are awake, but they don't usually respond that much. A lot of people call it a depersonalization, or they kind of will say that their experience is sort of like they're walking into a dreamlike state. So they kind of know what's going on, but they can't respond. Usually in this type of incidents, they'll have muscle spasms. They might experience tingling in their fingers or the part that is having muscle spasms. Usually repetition of movements. For more impaired focal seizures, that is when it's more staring spells, also characterized by spasms and repetitive movements. So interestingly, since the temporal lobe is obviously, like we talked about earlier, more focused on language comprehension, some of these repetitive movements are based around the face, specifically around the lips. So it'll kind of look like sometimes people are maybe chewing gum or looks like they're about to say something when they're experiencing a seizure. And these also only last about 2 minutes each. So some of the subcategories of seizures are myoclonic, clonic, tonic, or tonic-clonic seizures, also known as grand mal seizures. So myoclonic seizures are usually single spasms, maybe one thing at a time. People usually are aware of what's going on. Tonic seizures are pretty uncommon. Usually have to do with facial and upper body movements. This is kind of when we get into the realm of altered states of consciousness. Sometimes people experience confusion post-ictal, meaning right after their seizure. People sometimes experience loss of bladder, sometimes they'll drool on themselves or experience tachycardia, which is an increased heart rate. There's also clonic seizures, which are also sort of a loss of control of body functions, and these are where we see more aggressive jerking. and the tonic-clonic seizures, which these are what more people associate epilepsy with, even though they're really not that common. This is basically tonic symptoms and then clonic, hence the name. So tonic where they kind of start to lose consciousness, and clonic when we see more of the aggressive body movements. These usually only last about 1 to 3 minutes, usually no more than 5, but we're told that if they experience more than one, either back to back, or it lasts longer than 5 minutes, it's really important to seek medical help. So I did talk a little bit earlier about auras, but another type of aura that people will experience is deja vu. And there's not a ton of psychological research on deja vu because it's not really something that we can induce. It's really difficult. It kind of just happens randomly. But it kind of makes sense for people with specifically this type of epilepsy in this area to experience deja vu because there's so much information being processed at once and so much being integrated that kind of makes sense for things to get a little jumbled up and out of time reference. So it's really interesting to point out that sometimes people with this specific localized type of epilepsy will experience a sort of mysticism either before, during, or after their seizures. People will sometimes describe it as a sort of divine entity. It can come in forms of feelings or even hallucinations. For example, Ramachandran talked about one of his clients who frequently mentioned that he had full-on conversations with God, and he had looked over his sheet and noticed that the man had experienced temporal lobe epilepsy since he was a teenager. So, like I mentioned, sometimes people will experience divine entities, or sometimes people will experience different changes in their personality. The non-clinical term for this is called Geschwin syndrome. This is because it's very rare for this type of thing to happen, but it's characterized by extreme religiosity, intense emotions, sudden extreme cognition, so like hyperfixations or hyperfocusing, and an altered sexuality. So in terms of religiosity, it is hotly debated on whether or not the people who experience these types of seizures and have these divine experiences, whether they were religious before or after the experience. It's really common for people to have prior, maybe like experience going to church or have some sort of religious background that they can kind of base these things on. With that being said, not all of these ethereal sort of experiences are necessarily pleasurable. For example, in one case study of a 35-year-old military veteran, this man described himself as being a devout Christian for the majority of his childhood, and then he had sort of stopped going to church, and then at the age of 23, he experienced his first localized seizure in which he felt his own insignificance and presence of God. After he experienced that, he had ended up going back to church, and then after having a grand mal seizure at the hospital, afterwards, he said that he had heard heavenly voices abusing him, felt rays shown on him to punish him. They caused a burning sensation, and said he had been twisted around until his bones were nearly broken. Not that great. So another case to talk about is that of a 55-year-old bus driver who experienced left temporal lobe seizures. So he said that for the majority of his life, he was sort of an on-again, off-again Christian, mildly religious. On one day in the middle of one of his routes, he had this celestial feeling and started telling passengers how pleased he was to be in heaven, kind of had broken speech that didn't really make sense, a little bit unsettling. He had also experienced another incident where he had driven off the main road onto back roads for about 20 minutes before getting back onto the actual proper bus route. So, unfortunately, he did lose his job as a bus driver, but ironically, he also said that he declined in his religiosity after these experiences and actually denounced his faith altogether. So even though temporal lobe seizures can be localized to a specific portion of the brain, and we can use case studies to kind of learn more about the different types of seizures and how they may affect people, it's still really hard to understand completely because each person's experience is very independent of each other.